She was sent to Ashfang like an offering carved from silence. A wolfless bride delivered to a kingdom that measured worth in fangs, meant to be quietly forgotten behind the grandeur of its throne. But when the rival Alpha King dragged her into the sacred flames of the Agni Kai months later, the last thing he ever saw was the cold, unhurried smile of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. The wind that tore down from the Ashfang peaks carried more than cold. It carried consequence, pine and frost and the iron bite of old blood. The mountains had been breathing that particular scent for 3 centuries, long enough that the wolves of Ashfang no longer noticed it. To them, it was simply the smell of home. To anyone arriving from the south, it was a warning written in air. Within the black stone walls of Ashfang Keep, weakness was not merely punished, it was erased. The hierarchy here required no decree, no written law, no council vote. It simply was, as fixed and unmovable as the mountain bedrock beneath the keep's foundations. At the crown of that hierarchy stood the Alpha King. Below him, the Alphas, the Betas, the warriors, the healers, and the craftspeople who kept the kingdom breathing. And at the very bottom, standing on the trembling edge of acknowledgement, were the Wolfless. The moon goddess, the kingdom believed, did not make mistakes. Those she passed over had simply not been worth the gift. Seraphina Vale was precisely that, a woman the moon had forgotten. To the eyes that followed her through the receiving hall of Ashfang Keep, Seraphina appeared to be assembled entirely from things that could break. She was pale in the particular way of southern nobility, not the healthy ivory of winter skin, but the faint translucence of someone who had spent too many years indoors, too many years being decorative. Her golden hair fell past her shoulders in loose, unhurried waves, catching the torchlight with a softness that seemed almost apologetic. Her gown was deep blue velvet, trimmed in northern grey fur, embroidered along the neckline in gold, formal, elegant, and entirely wrong for a warrior's court. She looked like something a more refined kingdom had accidentally left behind. She had arrived at the keep 4 days ago, delivered by her family's envoy, with minimal ceremony, and a letter that said, in diplomatic language, everything it needed to. Seraphina was 23. She had never shifted. No wolf had ever risen beneath her skin. No bond had ever pulled at her bones beneath the full moon. Her family had tried everything. Healers, moon rituals, ancient rites from distant territories. Nothing. The moon goddess had made her opinion known, and so House Vale had made theirs. Their youngest daughter, their quietest, their most overlooked, their most embarrassing secret, had been offered to the most powerful Alpha King in the north as a gesture of political goodwill. A bride to cement a fragile border agreement, a woman traded like a treaty clause. To everyone who witnessed her arrival, the message was plain. She was not a gift. She was a problem, elegantly wrapped. Kaelen Draven stood at the far end of the great hall, and the room shifted around him the way weather shifted around stone, instinctively, without argument. He was not simply large, though he was that too, broad-shouldered and iron-spined in his wolf fur mantle, standing well above every man near him. It was something older than size, something in the stillness of him, the kind of stillness forged through too many battles to be startled by anything anymore. His hair was dark, his jaw cut sharp as winter ridgeline, and his eyes held the particular quality of a man who had watched kingdoms fall and taken notes. The crown at his brow was iron, unembellished, chosen deliberately. He needed no gold to be believed. He had won 17 territorial conflicts before the age of 30. He had buried his younger brother in the wreckage of one. He had not permitted himself to grieve either in any way that the court could see. When Kaelen looked across the hall to where his new bride stood near the far hearth, he felt something move through him that he had not expected. Not contempt, not desire, pity. She was not weeping. That, at least, surprised him. She was not performing gratitude, or trembling, or searching the room for someone to reassure her. She simply stood, at a slight remove from her envoy, a goblet of warmed, spiced wine, held loosely in both hands, and she was watching, not with the wide, frightened gaze of someone overwhelmed, but with the slow, careful attention of someone taking inventory. It unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. My king. Tauren appeared at his left shoulder, his beta, his oldest friend, and his most reliable source of poorly timed honesty. Tauren's golden eyes tracked the woman across the room, with the expression he reserved for things he found both baffling and mildly offensive. No wolf. Kaelen said nothing. I spoke with the envoy, Tauren continued, as though silence were an invitation. 23 years. No shift. No sign of a bond. Not even a flicker. He paused, apparently waiting for a reaction, and received none. She has the hands of a lady-in-waiting and the presence of a church mouse. Whatever the Veils were thinking, it was not. Tauren! The beta went quiet. Across the hall, Seraphina brought the goblet to her lips. Her eyes moved, past the fireplace, past the betas flanking the far door, past the mounted wolf iron above the arch. And then, briefly, they moved to Kaelen. She did not flinch. She did not smile. She simply looked at him with the measured calm of a woman who had already learned everything she needed to know about this room. And then she looked away. Kaelen's jaw tightened slightly. She looks lost, Tauren murmured. Kaelen said nothing, because the wolfless bride standing at the edge of his great hall, pale and golden-haired and dressed in blue, did not look lost to him. She looked like she was waiting. For something, for someone, for a particular moment to arrive. He could not say what. But months later, when the Agni Kai fires rose 40 feet into the winter sky, and an undefeated Alpha King stepped into the circle to end her, Kaelen Draven would finally understand exactly what Seraphina Veil had been waiting for. She had been waiting for him to challenge her, and she had already decided how it would end. What no one at Ashfang Keep understood, what no one had ever been permitted to understand, was that the quiet woman by the fire had not always been quiet. She had simply been taught that silence was the sharpest weapon of all, and her teacher had been the most dangerous man she had ever known. She did not sleep well in unfamiliar places. She never had. In the hours before dawn, when Ashfang Keep breathed its slowest, when the perimeter watch howls thinned to silence, and the corridors held nothing but the creak of iron-bound timber, Seraphina rose. She dressed without a candle. Darkness had never frightened her. It was simply a room with fewer witnesses. She moved through the keep the way she moved through everything, unhurried, exact. She counted doors, noted which hinges had been recently oiled and which announced themselves, observed the sentry rotation, studied the particular gait of the beta posted outside the War Council chamber, a drag in his left foot, old injury, likely the knee. She committed the Great Hall's exits to memory, traced sightlines, calculated angles, catalogued load-bearing columns. To anyone watching, she was simply a lost bride, wandering strange corridors in the dark. She was not lost. She was learning. The first time Seraphina understood she was different, she was 7 years old. Her cousin had shifted in the courtyard of Vale Manor, a sudden explosion of silver fur and howling triumph. The boy's wolf, bounding across the grass, while the family applauded, and her aunt wept openly with pride. Seraphina had stood at the gathering's edge and pressed one hand flat against her sternum, waiting to feel something stir. Nothing stirred. She tried again at 10, at 13, at 16. Nothing. Her mother had stopped meeting her eyes somewhere around her 12th birthday. Her father began introducing her last at formal events. Her brothers mastered the particular habit of speaking around her, rather than to her, the conversational trick of people who have quietly decided someone isn't entirely real. Over the years, she became a kind of furniture, present, acknowledged only when inconvenient. Only one person had ever refused that verdict. Cassian Vale had been exiled from the southern kingdoms before Seraphina was born, for reasons the family had carefully removed from all official record, which meant they had been considerable. He was 71 when he began training her. He was not gentle about it. The morning after her first session, 9 years old, legs shaking from 3 hours of footwork drills on cold stone, he had simply looked down at her and said, "Again." She stood up. He taught her swordsmanship. Not ceremonial, not decorative, but the clean, surgical kind, designed to end a fight before it became a spectacle. He taught her footwork, until she crossed gravel without sound. endurance, until her lungs stopped arguing, strategy, how to read a room, an opponent, a moment, before committing to any part of it. Watch their shoulders, he told her once, guiding her attention during a sparring session. Not their eyes. Eyes are theatre. Shoulders tell you what the body has already decided. She watched. She learned. She came to him every chance she was given, and many chances she made herself, for 16 years. On the morning the marriage envoy arrived at Vale Manor, Cassian had held her hands in his, turned them palm up, and studied the scarring there. Years of hilt grip and blade work mapped across her skin in pale, deliberate lines. Power makes warriors arrogant, he said quietly. Skill makes them dangerous. Remember that, when the time comes. She had asked him when that would be. He had only smiled. By her third day at Ashfang Keep, Kaelen Draven had begun noticing things he had not intended to notice. She never complained. Not about the cold corridors, the unfamiliar food, or the whispers that shadowed her through every hall she entered. He had expected some performance of fragility, the polished, southern nobility version of adjustment. She offered none. She simply absorbed the new world around her, with the steady patience of someone who had spent years practicing exactly that. The questions she occasionally put to his counsel were not social. They were structural, precise. Not the questions of a woman trying to make herself agreeable, the questions of someone mapping power dynamics and filing the answers carefully away. Torin had mentioned it once, baffled. Kaelen had said nothing. He also noticed the sadness she carried. Not loudly, she never performed it, but in certain unguarded moments, when she believed herself unobserved, something settled across her features, like the last light leaving a room. The expression of someone who had been alone for a very long time and had stopped expecting that to change. It stayed with him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He was thinking of it still when he stepped into the eastern corridor in the grey pre-dawn, documents in hand and sleep refusing him, and found her standing somewhere she had no reasonable business being. She turned without startling. They looked at each other in the half-light. His gaze dropped, not deliberately, to her hands, where her sleeves had fallen back. The scars crossed both palms in pale, deliberate lines. Not accidental, not the marks of a sheltered life, the kind of scarring that came from years of repetitive, intentional, relentless work. He raised his eyes back to hers. She did not explain them, did not move to cover them. She simply held his gaze in the dark corridor, with the same steady, unhurried calm she carried everywhere, waiting for him to decide what he thought he was looking at. For the first time since her arrival, Kaelen Draven was not sure he knew the answer. He did not ask about the scars that night. He simply inclined his head, a small, careful acknowledgement, and continued down the corridor. Seraphina watched him go, then turned back to the dark window she had been studying. Below, the training yard was empty. The sentry rotation had a 12-minute gap between the eastern and western posts. She filed that away too. The storm arrived the following morning without negotiation. It came off the Ashfang peaks like a verdict, white and absolute, burying the mountain roads within hours, sealing the keep's outer gates by noon. The wolves took it in stride. Storms were seasonal here, expected, practically scheduled. But for 3 days, Ashfang Keep became its own enclosed world, smaller than usual, its inhabitants thrown together in the overlap of shared corridors and communal fires, which meant Kaelen Draven had considerably fewer places to be that did not eventually contain Seraphina Vale. The first evening, he found her in the lower library beside the main hearth, not reading, as he might have expected, but watching the fire with the particular focused attention he was beginning to recognize as something other than blankness. He sat down because the chair was there, and the hour was late, and he was tired of his own study. They said nothing for several minutes. "You watch every fire like you're calculating it," he said finally. She considered that. Fire behaves according to rules. Most things do, if you watch long enough. He looked at her sideways. What rules is this one following? It's burning unevenly. The wood on the left is damp. It will collapse inward within the hour. She paused. I'd move that candelabra. He glanced at the candelabra in question, then back at her. He moved it. The fire collapsed inward 40 minutes later, exactly as she had said. She did not point this out. Thirdy left. The second incident was less dignified. The eastern staircase had developed a particular treachery overnight. A patch of ice spreading beneath the narrow window, where the storm had found a gap in the casement. Kaelen rounded the corner from the corridor above, just as Seraphina's foot found it. He moved before thinking. His hand caught her arm. Both hands, actually, one at her elbow and one at her waist, and they stood suspended for a moment at the edge of the stair landing, her weight against his hands, and the ice gleaming indifferently below. She recovered her footing and stepped back. "Thank you," she said, with the precise tone of someone who was accustomed to managing their own disasters and found outside assistance mildly inconvenient. He almost smiled, caught it before it arrived. "You were mapping the corridor again." Her pause told him he was right, before her expression did. "The window seal needs replacing," she said, "before someone less fortunate finds that step." He ordered it replaced that afternoon. The third evening, the kitchen sent 2 meals to the wrong rooms simultaneously, a logistical error born of storm-reduced staff and general chaos. By the time the mistake surfaced, the food was cold and the kitchen fires were banked. Torren, who had caused the confusion, offered a response that consisted primarily of an apologetic shrug. Kaelen and Seraphina ate in the small antechamber off the great hall, at a table sized for 4, with the fire doing its best and the wind making itself heard through every crack in the outer wall. It was, by any formal measure, an unremarkable meal. She asked him once, carefully, about the memorial plaque she had passed in the eastern corridor. The name on it. He was quiet for a moment. "My brother," he said. "Aldrich. He died in the Craven Moor border conflict. 6 years ago." He set down his cup. He was 21. He should not have been at that border at all. I placed him there. She did not offer the usual consolations, did not rush to fill the silence. "You've been carrying that a long time," she said finally. "I carry it correctly," he replied. "That's all I can do." She looked at him, not with pity, which he would have resented, but with the steady recognition of someone who understood the specific weight of a guilt that had no resolution. "My family considered me their most manageable failure," she said. "Matter of fact, no performance in it, too flawed to present, too connected to discard. I spent most of my life in rooms slightly smaller than the ones everyone else used." She picked up her cup. "One learns to take up very little space." The firelight moved across her face. Kaelen looked at her, truly looked, in the way he rarely permitted himself with anyone, and felt something shift at the base of his chest. Something he had kept very carefully weighted down for a considerable number of years. He noticed, again, that her eyes had moved twice during the meal to the door, and once to the iron bracket above the fireplace, the one a person could use as a weapon, if they needed to. She always did that. Every room, every entrance, every object with an edge. He had been telling himself it was nerves. He was no longer certain that was true. "You're not what they sent you here to be," he said quietly. She met his gaze across the small table. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." The storm pressed against the walls. The fire held steady. Neither of them moved to leave. And for the first time since Aldrich, Kaelen Draven sat in a room with another person and did not feel entirely alone in it. The Winter Summit had been Kaelen's father's institution, a yearly convening of Alpha Lords beneath Ashfang's banner, theoretically to discuss trade, border agreements, and pack law. In practice, it was a room full of dangerous men, deciding how dangerous they were willing to be to one another that season. This year, one of them had already decided. The Ravens had arrived 3 days before Ragnar did. Not formal correspondence, not a summit registry entry, or a diplomatic letter with a wax seal. Just birds, 12 of them, black as pitch, landing on the keep's eastern parapet, in a line at dawn, bearing no message at all. Everyone in Ashfang who was old enough knew what it meant. Ragnar Blackthorn did not send words ahead of himself. He sent silence. The words came after, and by then, it was generally too late. The other summit lords began arriving that morning, with slightly more speed than courtesy required. Torren oversaw the preparations, with the expression of a man diffusing something, The kitchens doubled their output. The guard rotation was quietly tripled. Seraphina watched all of it from the upper gallery and said nothing. Ragnar Blackthorn arrived on the second morning, with 300 warriors at his back, and no apology for it. The Bloodscar Dominion's banners, black and deep arterial red, came through the outer gate first, carried by men built like architecture. Then the warriors themselves, filing through in close formation, wearing black armor that had seen enough combat to stop being shiny about it. They moved in a particular silence that was not the silence of discipline. It was the silence of people who had stopped needing to communicate, who had simply done this enough times that the pattern was written into their bodies. And then Ragnar. He was not the largest man Kaelen had ever faced across a table, but he occupied space in a way that defied the geometry of rooms, as though the air itself rearranged to account for him. He stood perhaps 2 inches shorter than Kaelen, but wider across the shoulders, by a measure that suggested something less like training and more like design. His beard was dark and unkempt in the specific way of men who had never had cause to care what they looked like. His eyes were a flat, depthless grey, the colour of ice over deep water, and they moved across Ashfang's great hall with the slow, proprietorial interest of a man pricing something he intends to acquire. He had conquered 7 territories in 11 years. He had executed the alpha of every one of them personally, by hand, in front of their packs. He had not lost a single direct challenge in his adult life. He smelled blood long before he spilled it. That, his enemies said, was the most frightening thing about him. The summit convened in the great hall at midday. Ragnar sat across from Kaelen with the relaxed comfort of someone who had pre-decided the outcome of every conversation he would have today, and the opening formalities dissolved almost immediately under the weight of his particular style of diplomacy, which was to say, no diplomacy at all. Ashfang's eastern corridors have thinned, he said, cutting across a territorial discussion, with the ease of a man who had never once waited his turn. I counted 18 wolves along the ridge approach. 2 years ago that number was 30. He looked at Kaelen, with flat grey eyes. Trouble recruiting? The room tensed. Ashfang's numbers are Ashfang's business, Kaelen said, his voice entirely even. They become my business, Ragnar replied pleasantly. When they border mine. He let that settle. Let it do its slow work across the assembled lords, and then his gaze moved, as gazes eventually did in that room, to Seraphina. She was seated 2 chairs from Kaelen, still and straight-backed, her hands folded on the table. She had not shifted once since the proceedings began. Ragnar looked at her the way a man looks at something he finds mildly amusing and entirely unthreatening. Then he laughed, not performatively, genuinely, a short, deep sound of actual entertainment. That, he said, nodding in her direction with the consideration of a man pointing out an architectural curiosity, is your Luna. The air in the hall changed. 23, and still unshifted. He leaned back. I've whelped pups with more wolf in them. His eyes moved back to Kaelen, all the amusement clearing as cleanly as weather. You married a defect and dressed her in Ashfang blue. What does that say about the king wearing the crown? Kaelen's wolf moved beneath his skin, a hard, sudden surge, the kind that preceded decisions his mind hadn't approved yet. His hand pressed flat against the table. The pressure of keeping still was something physical, something that cost him. Seraphina did not move, did not blink. Her eyes remained on the middle distance with that particular quality of focused stillness, a candle flame in a room without wind. Ragnar had already lost interest in her. That was the thing about him. The cruelty was almost incidental. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, pressing it flat against the table with one hand. The Rite of Embers, he said simply. I am invoking the Agni Kai. The room stopped. Every Alpha Lord at that table went perfectly, simultaneously still. Ragnar's grey eyes found Seraphina again. And I challenge your wolfless bride. He smiled, slow and certain. Let the sacred fire settle what diplomacy cannot. The document sat open on the table between them. Under the rite, the challenge could not be refused. The document was still on the table when the room broke open. Not loudly. The Alpha Lords were too experienced for loud. But Kaelen watched it happen in the small, controlled ways that mattered. Lord Fenwick reaching instinctively for his goblet and finding it empty. Torrhen's jaw setting like something had been bolted into place, the collective exhale that moved through the assembled men, like wind through a gap in stone. Ragnar accepted wine from a bloodscar attendant and settled back in his chair, entirely content. Seraphina had not moved. The council convened within the hour, absent the summit lords, absent Ragnar. Present were Kaelen's 7 senior advisors, Torrhen, 2 pack elders old enough to remember the last Agni Kai, and the keep's head healer, whose attendance everyone found quietly ominous. They spoke as though Seraphina were not seated at the far end of the table. "The law is absolute," Elder Maren said, her voice carrying the specific gravity of someone delivering a sentence. "The right of embers cannot be declined, delayed, or substituted. The challenged party must enter the fire circle personally." She did not look at Seraphina. "Ragnar is undefeated. He has killed 11 challengers in sanctioned Agni Kai alone. 12, the second elder corrected quietly. Nobody responded to that. Lord Cassin, the youngest of the advisors, leaned forward. "There must be a legal argument, a procedural." "There isn't," Torrhen said flatly. "Then we negotiate." "Ragnar didn't come here to negotiate." Kaelen's voice ended that line of thinking without raising. He had been standing at the window since the meeting began. The storm had moved off overnight, leaving the world outside colorless and sharp. He came for Ashfang. The challenge is the mechanism. The outcome he's already decided. The room went silent in the way of people facing a thing they cannot solve. Kaelen looked at his council, at the faces of men who had followed him through 17 conflicts, who had trusted his judgment in places where the wrong call meant mass graves, and saw the same conclusion written across every one of them. They had already buried her. He left the council chamber without dismissing anyone. He found her on the eastern rampart, standing against the parapet, with her face to the night air, and her hair moving in the remnant wind. Not weeping, not visibly afraid, simply present, in the particular way she had of occupying spaces without requiring anything from them. He stood beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "The council believes I'll die," she said. "Yes. Do you?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. Not hesitation, but the specific pause of a man deciding to be precise. "I believe Ragnar is the most dangerous challenger I have encountered in 20 years of watching men fight." He turned to face her. "And I will not watch you walk into that circle." She looked at him. "There are roads south that avoid Bloodscar territory entirely," he said. "We can have horses ready before dawn. Torrhen knows a settlement in the Greyvale passes where you would be safe, under a different name. I would send coin, resources." He held her gaze steadily. "Ragnar wants Ashfang. Let him have it. I will rebuild elsewhere. I have done it before." She stared at him. "You would abdicate," she said. "Surrender your kingdom." "I would surrender a territory," he corrected quietly. "You are not a territory." Something happened in her expression. Something small and catastrophic, like a fault line taking on pressure. She turned back to the parapet and the dark below it, and he watched the line of her shoulders shift and then hold. "My father traded me," she said, "to protect his harvest yields." She said it without bitterness. That was the worst of it, the complete absence of surprise. "My brothers forgot my name at formal events. My mother stopped looking at me by the time I was 12. She was quiet for a moment. "No one has ever." She stopped. He waited. She turned to face him. And then, without announcement, she reached for his hand and pressed it open between both of hers, turning it palm up. She placed her own palm flat against his. He looked down. He had noticed the scars before, in the corridor, in the insufficient light. But here, close, with no pretense around them, he could read them properly. They crossed both palms in deliberate, repetitive lines. Years of them. The heel of her right hand carried a callus, so specific in its placement, it could only come from one thing: sustained grip on a long-handled blade. The kind built over a decade, not a season. He looked up slowly. Her eyes were steady on his. "My grandfather was the finest swordsman in 4 kingdoms," she said. "He trained me every day for 16 years, every morning before the household woke, every night after it slept." She did not move her hands from his. Ragnar Blackthorn has never fought me. He has fought no one like me, because nobody has ever been permitted to know I exist. Kaelen was very still. Seraphina, I intend to win, she said, simply, cleanly, the way she said everything, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already done the calculation and found the answer satisfactory. The parapet wind moved between them. Kaelen looked at the scars mapped across her palms, at the woman who had spent a lifetime being dismissed by every room she entered, quietly preparing for the one moment that would matter. For the first time, he felt something that was not pity. It was considerably more dangerous than that. Dawn did not arrive gently. It came in hard and colorless over the Ashfang peaks, the sky the particular shade of white that preceded neither warmth nor mercy. By the time the first watch horn sounded, the city below the keep was already moving. Not the ordinary movement of a morning beginning, but the compressed, urgent movement of thousands converging on a single point. Word had traveled overnight, the way bad news always did in Ashfang. Quickly, completely, and with considerable embellishment. The Wolfless Luna had accepted the Agni Kai. The sacred arena stood half a mile from the keep's southern gate, built into a natural bowl of the mountain rock that the original Ashfang kings had widened, over generations, into something vast and deliberate. Stone seating rose in tiered rings around a circular floor of pale granite, and at the arena's perimeter, the fire channels had been burning since before dawn. Deep trenches filled with rendered wolf pine resin that burned orange and savage and did not respond to wind. By mid-morning, every tier was filled. Not just Ashfang wolves. The summit lords had stayed. Ragnar's 300 warriors occupied the northern stands in a solid block of black and red, already loud. Merchants and traders who had been storm-delayed in the lower city pressed against the outer gates until the gates gave. Children sat on shoulders. Healers positioned themselves near the eastern entry, with the practical efficiency of people who had attended these things before. The noise was immense, and then, periodically, it swelled further, a living thing, cresting on itself. Kaelen stood in the king's enclosure, above the western entrance, and did not sit. Torrens stood beside him and said nothing. There was nothing to say that either of them hadn't already considered from every angle the night had offered. Below, the sacred fire threw its light across the empty granite floor. Ragnar entered from the northern gate at the appointed hour. The Bloodscar warriors rose as one, and their sound hit the arena like weather. He wore black armor from collar to boot, not ceremonial, not decorative, every piece of it earned, and he moved through the firelit entrance with the absolute unhurried confidence of a man arriving somewhere he had already decided belonged to him. He crossed to the arena's center, rolled one shoulder, looked around with mild interest, the way a man looks around a room he is about to purchase. The crowd's roar continued long after he stopped moving. He did not acknowledge it, did not need to. Then he looked toward the southern gate and waited, with the patience of something large and very certain. The southern gate opened. The crowd noise crested, expectant, loud, already tilting towards something that felt uncomfortably like appetite. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not as sound usually fades. It stopped the way a candle stops when someone covers it with a hand. Immediate, total, and leaving a ringing absence behind. Seraphina walked through the gate. She was not wearing a gown. Dark fitted leather covered her from throat to boot, cut close and unadorned, built for movement rather than appearance. Over it, a deep blue cloak, ashfang blue, worn deliberately, fell from her shoulders and caught the firewind as she walked. Her golden hair was tied back from her face. No crown, no jewels, no concession to ceremony. Across her back, in a harness worn smooth with use, rode a greatsword that had no business being carried by someone her size, long-bladed, cross-hilted, the steel catching the sacred fire in a single clean line of light as she moved. She walked to the arena's center without adjusting her pace. The silence followed her all the way. In the northern stands, one of Ragnar's warriors said something. A second laughed, then more of them, cascading. The particular laughter of men who had seen enough violence to recognize what they believed was about to happen, and found it entertaining in advance. Ragnar looked at her, at the sword, at her. The smile that crossed his face was not the cruelty from the great hall. It was something more specific. Genuine bafflement, briefly, and then amusement at his own bafflement, as though she had somehow managed to surprise him, simply by existing. "Steel," he said. His voice carried easily across the arena floor. "Against a king." He said it the way a person observes that someone has brought a candle to a wildfire. Seraphina stopped 6 feet from him. She reached back, drew the greatsword in a single motion, so practiced it held no drama at all, and brought it to a low, ready position at her side. She looked at him, directly, steadily, with those unhurried grey eyes that had been cataloguing rooms and exits and angles since the moment she arrived in Ashfang. "You should have been afraid," she said, quietly, conversationally. The way someone observes something true and unfortunate about the weather. Ragnar's smile dissolved. Something shifted behind his flat grey eyes. Not fear, not quite, but the first faint signal of a thing he had not prepared for, moving beneath the surface. He did not have time to name it. He had spent 11 years opening every duel the same way. Fast, overwhelming, total. He launched forward like something structural had given way, his enormous frame crossing the distance between them in 2 strides, his fist driving toward her with the force of a man who had ended things this way before and expected to again. The crowd surged to its feet, the sacred fires roared, and the Agni Kai began. She moved like she was stepping around furniture. That was the only way to describe it. The fist that should have ended the fight before it began passing through the space where her head had been a half-second earlier, and Seraphina simply not being there, already relocated 2 steps to Ragnar's left, with no visible urgency. He turned, swung again. She rolled beneath it and came up on the other side. The crowd, still standing, made a sound of confused disbelief. Ragnar fought the way all his fights had taught him to fight, with the settled certainty of a man whose strength had always been sufficient. He was fast for his size, which was the dangerous thing. Other large men telegraphed. Ragnar did not. His second strike came barely a breath after his first, adjusting mid-motion in the way of a body that had trained every day for 30 years. Seraphina ducked under it and moved laterally, her boots crossing the granite floor in the exact footwork pattern she had practiced on cold stone at an age when other children were being taught embroidery. She did not strike back. The crowd was beginning to notice this. "She's not fighting," Torrhen said quietly, to no one in particular. In the king's enclosure above the western gate, Kaelen said nothing. He was watching her feet. Ragnar pressed forward. He was too experienced to overextend, but experience had also taught him that sustained pressure dissolved most opponents, that fear accumulated like water, and at some point, it found the cracks. He threw 3 consecutive strikes in a controlled combination, driving her backward toward the fire channel at the arena's edge. She let him. That was the part the crowd missed, the specific quality of her retreat, the way it had direction. She wasn't fleeing toward the fire. She was maneuvering Ragnar across a particular section of the arena floor, repositioning him by increments, so small and gradual that it looked like desperation. She watched his shoulders. His right recovered a fraction slower than his left. Old damage, deep in the joint. She had seen it in the great hall when he reached across the table for the document. The slight overcompensation, the shift of weight. She had filed it away. She was still filing. His footwork favored an outside pivot to his left. His chin dropped slightly before a power strike. His breathing pattern ran in 4s. She needed 2 more exchanges. Ragnar gave her 1. He caught her. Not cleanly. She had read the angle a quarter second late, turned too slowly, and his forearm connected with her shoulder instead of her chest. It was perhaps a third of the force he'd intended, but it still drove her sideways, and she hit the granite hard enough to scatter the snow that had settled across it. Hard enough that a sound moved through the crowd. In the king's enclosure, Kaelen's hand closed on the enclosure rail. Seraphina got up. Her left hand moved along the greatsword's grip, resettling the calluses against the familiar lines of the hilt. She rolled the shoulder he'd hit, tested it. Acceptable. Then she looked at him, and she crossed the distance between them. The crowd did not understand what it was watching until Ragnar reeled back. until the thin red line opened across the back of his right forearm, precisely at the junction where his armor gapped, and the blood was already falling onto the pale granite before anyone had fully tracked the blade's path. Silence. Then a sound so large it seemed to have physical mass. Thousands of people making noise simultaneously, because no other response was available to them. Ragnar looked at his forearm, at the blood, at her. Something left his face. The professional remove, the settled certainty. It went quickly, replaced by something older and considerably less controlled. In the king's enclosure, Kaelen stopped gripping the rail. He was no longer watching with the locked-jaw terror of a man waiting for an outcome he couldn't influence. He was watching with something that had no name yet, something that was reorganizing everything he thought he understood about the woman standing on the arena floor. She had not been surviving. She had been shopping. Ragnar's control broke along a seam that had clearly always been there. The shift came from his shoulders first, the crack and surge of the partial transformation moving through him in a visible wave, his frame expanding, his spine bowing forward, as the wolf erupted into the space his human body occupied and exceeded it. His hands elongated, his jaw restructured. The armor across his upper back split at the seams. He did not complete the shift. He stopped it at the threshold, halfway, deliberate, where a man's mind still drove a body that was no longer entirely a man's. The crowd erupted. It was over. Everyone understood that now. The wolfless woman with a blade had bought herself a remarkable story and a quick death. Seraphina planted her feet in the snow and smiled. The half-shifted thing that had been Ragnar Blackthorn moved differently than the man had, faster, less considered. The wolf's instinct had overwritten the fighter's discipline, and what remained was something vast and enraged. And, underneath all of that, for the first time in 11 years of sanctioned killing, afraid. That was the thing about fear. It always arrived as aggression. He came at her like a structure collapsing, total, committed, no reserve, and the crowd noise became something continuous and formless, beyond individual voices, just sound filling the stone bowl of the arena, the way water fills a vessel. Seraphina moved left. Cassian Vale had told her once, on a cold morning in the manor's lower courtyard when she was 15 and exhausted, and had asked him why they never simply practiced the killing stroke. He had told her that a killing stroke practiced in isolation was a fantasy, that the stroke itself meant nothing, that what mattered was everything preceding it, every feint, every bait, every piece of information extracted, every wound placed not to end the fight, but to make the ending inevitable. Every giant falls because he believes he cannot, he had said. Your only task is to be present when the belief finally breaks. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. Ragnar's right arm was compromised. She had confirmed it with the cut, had felt the way his recovery slowed, the way his pivot to that side had grown fractionally wider to compensate. In his human form, the old injury had been managed. In the partial shift, with the wolf's mass redistributed across a frame not quite either one thing or the other, the shoulder had lost the precise muscle engagement that kept it functional under load. He didn't know she knew. That was the margin. She let him drive her across the arena for 3 more exchanges, absorbing his momentum with lateral movement, her boots finding the granite through the snow, with the certainty of a body that had done this 10,000 times before. His combinations were powerful, but they were also, she had determined, essentially a vocabulary of 6. He rotated through them in a pattern he had likely never needed to vary, because nothing had ever survived long enough to require it. She had mapped all 6 in the first 2 minutes. He threw the 4th combination. Overhand right, low sweep, forward charge. And she did the thing she had been timing since the cut. She went inside. Inside the sweep, inside his guard, closing the distance to nothing, her left elbow driving hard into the damaged shoulder at the exact angle that would compromise the joint completely. She felt it give, felt the structural failure transmit through her arm. And Ragnar's responding sound was not a warrior's sound. It was involuntary, uncontrolled. He staggered. 1 step, that was all. But 1 step was a door. Everything Cassian had built in her over 16 years converged into a single point in time, her feet planted. Weight transferred from back foot to front, in the kinetic chain he had made her repeat, until it was no longer a technique, but a reflex. Hips, torso, shoulder, arm, wrist, blade. Every segment in sequence, every segment committed. The greatsword came up from her low right, in an arc that was not spectacular, not theatrical, but geometrically precise, clean. She had always been clean. The sacred fire caught the blade on its way through. The sound that followed was not the crowd. The crowd had no sound. The arena, 10,000 people, 300 Bloodscar warriors, every Alpha Lord at the summit, the wolves of Ashfang filling every tier of stone, held a silence so complete it had texture. The fire burned. Snow continued its indifferent fall across the granite. Somewhere in the upper stands, a torch bracket creaked in the wind. Ragnar's body remained standing for 2 full seconds. Then it fell, and the head of the Bloodscar Dominion's undefeated Alpha King rolled across the sacred embers, trailing fire for a moment before the snow extinguished it, coming to rest at the far edge of the Agni Kai circle. Seraphina stood in the center of the arena. Her breathing was elevated, her left shoulder would bruise badly by morning. Her blade arm was steady. She did not raise her sword, did not look at the crowd, did not perform anything at all. She simply stood. The first to kneel was a Bloodscar warrior in the northern stands, then the man beside him, then the entire front row, moving outward like a stone dropped in still water, and then it crossed the divide into Ashfang's stands. Wolves dropping to one knee, one after another, the Alphas last, and the Pack Elders first. 10,000 people, on their knees. In the snow, the gate opened behind her. She knew his footsteps by now, the particular weight and rhythm of them, the way they covered ground without announcing themselves. She had catalogued those too, in the corridors and staircases of 3 storm-bound days. She turned. Kaelen stood at the arena's edge. No crown, no mantle, just the man, standing in the sacred fire's light, with an expression she had never seen on him before, and could not fully name. Something past awe, something that had dismantled itself, and not yet decided what to rebuild. Their eyes met across the granite and the snow and the silence. Neither of them moved, and the fire burned between them, and the 10,000 held their breath, and for one suspended moment, the Agni Kai belonged entirely to the 2 of them. The Bloodscar envoy came to the keep before nightfall. He was the ranking officer among Ragnar's 300, a broad, scarred beta named Korvath, who had the particular manner of a man accustomed to delivering strength, and finding himself, for the first time in his career, delivering something else. He stood in Ashfang's great hall without his weapons, and surrendered the Bloodscar Dominion's territorial seals one by one, placing them on the table with the careful movements of someone diffusing something. The assembled Alpha Lords watched without speaking. When it was done, Korvath looked not at Kaelen, he looked at Seraphina, and he bent his knee. Afterward, in the quiet antechamber, where 3 storms ago they had shared a misdirected meal, Seraphina sat by the fire and finally told him. Kaelen listened without interrupting. He had learned, over the accumulated hours of a brief and concentrated marriage, that she did not speak until she was ready, and that interrupting her was both futile and a waste of something worth waiting for. Cassian Vale had known Ragnar Blackthorn, not personally, by reputation, by pattern, by the intelligence networks of a man who had spent decades studying the architecture of power in the northern territories before his exile. Cassian had tracked the Bloodscar Dominion's expansion for years, and reached a conclusion that his family had dismissed as an old soldier's obsession. One day, Ragnar would come for Ashfang, and when he did, he would use the right of embers, because it was unrefusable, because it was absolute, and because Ragnar had never lost one. So Cassian had built the answer in the only material available to him, his overlooked, unwanted, Wolfless granddaughter. She was never weak, Kaelen understood, sitting across from her in the firelight. She was hidden. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then he stood and crossed the room and lowered himself to one knee in front of her chair, not as Alpha King of Ashfang, not as her husband by political arrangement, just as the man who had offered her a horse and an exile and told her a kingdom was worth less than she was, and had meant every word of it. "You saved this kingdom," he said. "You saved every wolf in it. You saved—" He stopped, steadied. "You saved me." She looked down at him. This iron-crowned, battle-worn, quietly grief-carrying man who had chosen her before he knew she was worth choosing, which was the only kind of choosing that counted. She reached down and took his face in her scarred hands. "Get up," she said softly. He did. She kissed him before either of them had decided she would, and he answered it with the particular certainty of a man who had been waiting some time without admitting it. And the fire burned steadily beside them, and outside the keep, the Ashfang wolves howled at a clearing sky. The formal arrangements took 3 weeks. The Bloodscar territories transferred to Ashfang's governance by the summit's witnessed agreement. The other Alpha Lords, freshly reminded that Wolfless did not mean harmless, ratified the terms with considerably less argument than they might otherwise have managed. Torren oversaw the border logistics with the grim satisfaction of a man whose warnings had been correct, and who intended to reference this at future councils. The Ashfang nobles who had whispered, cursed, and defective in Seraphina's first days at the keep, found themselves presented with new legislation before the month was out. By Kaelen's decree, and with Seraphina's precise and quietly relentless drafting hand behind every clause, the Wolfless of Ashfang would no longer stand at the hierarchy's bottom. They would train, they would be resourced, they would be seen. No one objected, no one was prepared to. By the following spring, the castle courtyard held training sessions 3 mornings a week. Seraphina ran them herself. On a morning when the frost had not yet left the stones, and the children's breath made small clouds in the cold air, a girl of perhaps 8 stood at the courtyard's edge, watching the older students work through their footwork drills. She had the specific stillness of a child who had already learned to watch from a distance, rather than expect to be included. She had no wolf. The courtyard knew it. The courtyard had not been kind about it. She tugged at Seraphina's sleeve as the session ended. "Can someone without a wolf become strong?" Seraphina looked at her for a moment, at the watchful eyes, at the hands already held slightly away from the body, already practicing the posture of someone who expected to be overlooked. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She crouched down. "Strength was never in the wolf," she said. Across the courtyard, Kaelen stood in the archway with his iron crown and his quiet eyes, watching his queen with an expression that had no name, because no word had yet been built adequate to contain it. The little girl nodded slowly. Something settled in her face. She stepped onto the training ground. The moon had never given Seraphina a wolf. Instead, it had given her a kingdom, a king who loved her, and a legend that would outlive them both.